Okay. Well, welcome everyone to our session today. Our title is Translating Real-World Evidence and Other Pharmacoepi Research Findings into Policy and Practice. And in particular, we're going to focus on two questions. The first is, how well are we doing in this regard, both as a field and then as a society? And then the second question is, what are the opportunities we have for improvement? I think there is what's called a very well-known and well-documented gap in healthcare today called the no-do gap. And this is really referring to kind of a disconnect between scientific research findings and actually getting those findings into policy and practice. This type of gap is also known as the research to practice gap, but it's really been seen repeatedly again and again and again. I just have a few examples here on this slide. For one is the use of steroids. There's been a persistently low prescribing of steroids for women in premature labor, despite evidence that of the beneficial effect of that on fetal lung surfactant. The use of anticoagulants, slow uptake in the prescribing of prophylactic anticoagulants for orthopedic surgery patients, and then thrombolytic treatment. There's quite a well-documented delay, 13-year delay between the demonstrated effectiveness of thrombolytic treatment for myocardial infarction and its support by key opinion leaders, which we all know is an important factor in uptake of a new medicine. So I think many of you are probably aware that this year the Society had took it upon itself to revisit the definition of pharmacoepidemiology. So it seems in many ways fitting or timely for us to also think about looking at and re-examining the mission of pharmacoepidemiology as well. And one of the questions is, we're all pharmacoepidemiologists have been really excellent in terms of generating high quality research. But is that enough? Is that sufficient? Or do we need to take what's been referred to as a more consequentialist approach, which is one in which we not only generate high quality data, but we also work effectively to see that it is translated into the research findings are translated into policy and practice. And of course, that's ultimately what we're all about. That's why we do the research, is in order to benefit patients, to improve safe, appropriate, and effective use of medicinal products, as well as to then subsequently see improved health outcomes. So our goal today is really to begin a dialogue in this regard. And obviously it's a huge topic, and we would, have no pretensions to think that we can make a big dent in this today in the course of this 90 minutes, but really want to begin that dialogue, and you're part of that dialogue. So we will have, we're aiming for about a 15-minute period at the end of the a series of presentations today, and would very much welcome your input on this issue. So with that, our speakers are as shown here. We have Dr. Donna Rivera, who's going to be talking about how well is pharmacoepidemiology translating its findings into use by regulators and what could be done to improve it. Our second speaker is Dr. Vincent Loray, who will be talking about how well is pharmacoepidemiology translating its findings for use by clinical practitioners and what can be done to improve this process. I will be talking about knowledge exchange process and how we can think about maybe transforming our orientation towards knowledge translation to knowledge exchange. And then we'll have a final presentation and comments by Dr. Toby Gerhardt, talking about ISPE's role in knowledge translation and knowledge exchange. And then we will open up for a panel discussion with Nicole Mittman, who's from CADIF, Chief Scientific Officer and Vice President, and Dr. Brian Strom, who is here in his capacity as editor of Pharmacoepidemiology and Drug Safety. Just to note, we did have a patient representative, Ms. Therese Lane. She's from the Canadian Arthritis Patient Alliance, and unfortunately, she fell ill right before the conference, so we won't be able to benefit from her presence and comments today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Donna. Just in the note.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for sticking with us on quite a long day. I'm going to talk about how well pharmacoepidemiology is translating into use for regulators and where are the opportunities for improvement. I have nothing to disclose. So I want to talk a little bit about in this session the concepts around implementation and the process. And implementation is the process of making something active or effective. And what does that mean from a scientific perspective? Well, we have the concept of implementation science, which is the scientific study of methods and strategies that facilitate the uptake of evidence-based practice and research into regular use by practitioners and policymakers. So this is exactly what Dr. Smith has mentioned. It's the focus of this session. How well are we taking what we learn and what we know and translating it into what we do? So the wisdom hierarchy talks about the hierarchical nature of how data translates into knowledge and how the processes increase in complexity. For example, from the task hierarchy of collecting data to the informational level of summarizing and analyzing it, and then the knowledge component of synthesis of the data and decision-making. So it's been discussed actually, interestingly, with our objective being decision-making, how the knowledge, data, and information come together and through this process and may actually be more accurately reflected as a circle. So we're continuously generating data, information, and knowledge. And so I want to start a little bit by talking about the FDA mission and the translation to regulatory science. So the FDA is responsible for protecting the public health by ensuring the safety, efficacy, and security of human and veterinary drugs, biological products, and medical devices, and by ensuring the safety of our nation's food supply, cosmetics, and products that emit radiation. Something to note as we think about the regulatory lens that we look through is that we do not take into account cost or payment or regulate the practice of medicine. These are not my most current slides. I'm gonna just one moment, a technical issue. Hang on just 1 second.
Did you go through the website?
That's right.
Well, let's try in the folder.
Well, I think the problem is that he's still gonna have to pull them off. So
This doesn't use it?
no,
No. Okay.
I think I'll go fix it if that's the case.
Oh, it's 415.
Yes,
Which one?
on the bottom.
Oh, yeah, it's the same one.
Okay. Let me go to the ready room. Yeah, and I know the ready room. I'll fix it. Yeah. Okay. Let me go. All right, we're gonna make a little bit of a game time switch here, and change order. So, are you gonna take it, Meredith? Vin. Okay. All right. I'll be back.
Here.
In American football parlance, we're calling an audible. Looks like It's up here, but it's not,
It's not.
it looks like it's not in the presenter mode.
Let's clean up a bit.
All right. Thank you. So my name is Vin Loray. I am an infectious disease physician and pharmacoepidemiologist, and I'm coming to you from the standpoint of trying to give you some sense of how well is pharmacoepidemiology translating its findings into use by clinical practitioners, and importantly, what can be done to improve this process. So disclosures are on this slide. I don't think anything is relevant. My objectives are, I first want to review with you the frequency by which research is incorporated into clinical practice. I'm then going to discuss the key steps of research knowledge translation into practice. I'll talk a little bit about the barriers and facilitators specifically to research dissemination and adopting research into clinical practice. And then I'm going to conclude with some strategies that I think might help promote research knowledge translation. So we're increasingly seeing more and more pharmacoepidemiologic research produced, ever increasing rate. As an infectious disease physician, I see more and more advances in the treatments of HIV, hepatitis B and C, COVID-19, cancer, many other therapies. But translating that pharmacoepidemiology evidence into clinical practice has frankly been challenging, and there have been a number of deficits in translating the evidence into real-world practice. In Australia, 32 to 86% of healthcare providers are adherent to guideline for 22 conditions. In the Netherlands, 67% of healthcare providers are adherent to 30 national guidelines. And where I practice in the US, a separate study showed that only 55% of our practitioners adhere to recommended care for 14 conditions. And these deficits in translation of evidence to practice are referred to as the evidence practice gap. Research knowledge translation is a key approach to addressing the evidence practice gap. Has different names in different locations in Australia, Asia, Canada. Some refer to this as knowledge to action. In Africa, Europe, Latin America, the US, some refer to it as research utilization or uptake. Whatever is the jargon that one uses, the process is similar. First, knowledge is created. That's what most of us do here in ISPE. We generate the research. Once the knowledge is generated and created, the next key step to research knowledge translation is it must be spread. This is the research dissemination. And then the last step in this process is the knowledge is then applied into practice, adopted the research into practice. And there are limitations and barriers to these last two steps, dissemination and adoption into practice, that I would argue are really contributing to the evidence practice gap that we are seeing. I want to first talk about research dissemination, and then I will flip to adopting the research into practice. How can we, as pharmacoepidemiologists, promote the dissemination of our research? Most of us are presenting locally at our study sites, at our institutions, at our organizations. It's key that we ensure that locally we are engaging the relevant stakeholders, patients, healthcare providers, policymakers. We must present at conferences. We're obviously here at an international conference, but we should be thoughtful and intentional about, if we're trying to adopt our research into practice, to target the audience for whom our research is intended. So thinking about going to clinical society meetings and presenting our research in those venues is crucial beyond just our annual ICPE. When we're writing our discussion sections of our journals, we should be thoughtful about highlighting the clinical implications of the work that we are producing. Last year, we had a discussion about research science communication. Many journals now have plain language summaries, such as we do at PDS, and we should be very thoughtful and clear in our language on the implications so that we can enhance the ability to disseminate key results to the community. And finally, after the publication of our work, another way to enhance research dissemination is through engaging the media, whether that be in press releases, whether that giving interviews on podcasts. Many people are listening to podcasts as they are commuting, or even generating your summaries of your research into newsletters. So in terms of adopting the research into practice, there are a number of barriers to adopting research into clinical practice. We see more and more clinicians are really unaware of the research, whether that be due to the increasing volume of research, the increasing volume of journals that are now available, their limited time, or in some locales, their limited access to the journals, key barrier to adopting research into practice. Clinicians could be potentially obstinate people. They may not agree with the guidelines, the recommendations, or the research that we generate. They may not have the skills to appraise that evidence. Another key barrier. There may be inertia of previous practice. Clinicians may say, "This has been doing the same thing for the last 15 years. I don't want to change my practice." That's inertia of practice. Then there's the lack of outcome expectancy, the perception that the clinician will fail to motivate the patient. The clinician knows that smoking cessation is valuable, that will help to reduce morbidity and mortality and prolong survival. But when the clinician gets into the room with the patient, the clinician thinks, "I'm not going to go and advise this patient. It's likely that they won't change their behavior. I'm not even going to try." That's lack of outcome expectancy. And then there are external factors that are important barriers. There may be insufficient costs, insufficient support in their clinical practice. They may be concerned about the costs of implementing and adopting new research into practice, or they may frankly think if the adoption of research into practice isn't reimbursed, they may not have the desire, the impetus to adopt that into practice. So how can we as pharmacoepidemiologists promote the adoption of our research into practice? I think first and foremost, it's crucial that at the development stage of our work, we collaborate with clinicians, collaborate with patients, ensure that our aims are clinically relevant and important. At the time of publication, we should, again, consider who is the audience for whom our research is intended. Target high-impact, clinically oriented journals. Get your research to the audience that you're intending. Present your research at clinical society meetings. This is another place to touch point, either individually, in groups, or in entire audiences. And then lastly, think about liaising with members of clinical practice guidelines. The inclusion of research into clinical practice guidelines really helps to promote application of evidence. Guidelines are widely read by clinicians. They often have enormously high impact. These guidelines are typically written by clinicians with research training and usually include a synthesis of the existing research, graded levels for evidence, and clinical practice recommendations based on research. In addition to my role as a pharmacoepidemiologist, I'm one of the co-chairs of the U.S. National Hepatitis C Guideline Panel. There's only 4 chairs. I'm the only observational researcher. I'm the one who's helping to bring real-world data, real-world evidence results to the forefront of our group so that we can incorporate them into guidelines and disseminate them to the community. I want to conclude with a few strategies to suggest to promote pharmacoepi research knowledge translation. Strategy 1, facilitating the inclusion of research into guidelines. Collaborate with clinicians, with patients, with key stakeholders. This will help you to get your foot in the door. It will help to facilitate conversations with the key target people for whom this is intended. Consider strongly the clinical implications of your work when you're formulating your aims, when you're designing your studies. Strategy number 2, as a field, we should really consider developing interventions to increase adherence to guidelines. We should study barriers to guideline adherence. They're different in different settings for different groups. We should consider surveying clinicians' behaviors. We've seen more and more at this meeting, focus on mixed methods and qualitative research. This is important for us to understand what the barriers and facilitators are. And then lastly, we should think about strategies to promote and monitor implementation science. Implementation science approaches will help to get these research knowledge into practice. Development and monitoring of treatment cascades has been very useful, particularly in infectious diseases. HIV treatment cascades, our group developed the first hepatitis C treatment cascade. Understanding where the barriers are in the steps to care and management are the key way to highlight to the field, policymakers, and stakeholders where the needs are and where the gaps are. So to summarize, I've given you some sense of the significant deficits in translating research evidence into practice. I've highlighted that I think research knowledge translation can potentially overcome this evidence to practice gap, but it will require really enhancing research dissemination and overcoming barriers to the adoption of research into practice. And then I concluded with some suggested strategies to promote knowledge translation. I think this is a great initial opportunity to converse about this subject. I appreciate Meredith bringing this all together, and I thank you for your attention.
Oh.
All right. We're going to try this again. Round 2. I was told this happened earlier in this room, so maybe some technological difficulties with the computer, but we're going to get to it. So I'm not going to go back over what I already talked about before, and we'll jump right into kind of the 2 constructs that we think about when we think about the use of real-world data. That's real-world data for safety and real-world data for effectiveness. So we'll start with safety. So starting with safety, monitoring the safety of regulated products is a major part of the FDA mission in our ability to protect public health. Sentinel is the FDA's national electronic system, which has transformed the way that researchers monitor the safety of FDA regulated medical products. So within this context, Sentinel launched the initiative in 2008 and now has a strategic vision of how to enhance the foundation of Sentinel through various ways, such as expanding capacities, accelerating access to broaden the use of real-world evidence, creating it as a national resource, and disseminating knowledge to advance regulatory science. It can do so through a variety of mechanisms and study types, and so there have been 489 Sentinel studies across various purposes and study types. And what I really want to highlight here is one example of turning research into labeling. The FDA Sentinel Initiative's study found a small increased risk of non-melanoma skin cancer associated with hydrochlorothiazide use. And from this study, right here, the FDA has changed the warnings and precautions, updated the warnings and precautions in adverse events sections to reflect the information in the drug labeling. So it's really translating research into actual drug labeling. Now I want to move to, and we'll spend the majority of my time focusing on real-world data for effectiveness. I want to walk you through the regulatory lens of how we think about evidence evaluation. So it's the use of real world data can, in the context of clinical study, can be trial data plus or minus real world data. So kind of depends, but if we're thinking in this context, data can be submitted in a clinical package that includes both types of data. We think about whether or not the data is from an adequate and well-controlled investigation, if there's substantial evidence of effectiveness, and then we conduct a benefit risk assessment. So moving through this process, in Section 314 of the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act, we think of the conduct of an adequate and well-controlled investigation as the ability and the purpose of this of distinguishing the effect of a drug from other effects, such as spontaneous change in the course of disease, placebo effect, or bias observation. And I'll call your attention to the bias observation component because I really think this speaks actually directly in the context of real world data to all of the work we do methodologically in the context of this in building and ensuring we can build an adequate and well-controlled study. So moving on to the concept of substantial evidence, which is in another part of our regulations, really substantial evidence consists of one or more adequate and well-controlled studies on the basis of which it could be fairly and reasonably concluded by experts that the drug will have the effect it purports to have under the conditions of intended use. So within this construct, you have adequate and well-controlled studies, and whether or not there's an adequate and well-controlled study is kind of the initial step of how you may generate substantial evidence. But ultimately, it relies on the benefit risk assessment, which is an integral part of our regulatory review of marketing applications for all new drugs and biologics. This assessment captures evidence, uncertainties, and reasoning used to determine the specific regulatory decisions. So this also serves as a tool for communicating FDA's thinking on particular decision making. The benefit risk assessment is case specific. It is multidisciplinary. It includes various teams, and hopefully we're seeing throughout this in the importance of collaboration, clinical, biostatistics, epidemiology, and of course, from an FDA perspective, there's CMC, there's manufacturing. There are a lot of other components that really look at this and ensure that the therapeutic context and that the nature and severity of the condition that the drug is intended to be utilized for can really be robustly ascertained from the evidence. So within the benefit risk assessment, we take a look at the evidence, the uncertainties, the therapeutic context, and the regulatory options to in totality assess the benefit risk of a medical product. So now I want to highlight some approvals that have included the use of real world data in addition to the ones that have been highlighted already this week. So the FDA has approved abatacept for the prophylaxis of acute graft versus host disease, and that was built on a study that used data from CIBMTR, a registry source, and also tacrolimus, which used real world data from another registry source from SRTR. And I also want to talk about opportunities for interaction. So there's, I think, a lot of momentum in the context of RWE across the agency, and I think across our field, which is, I think, just what we're seeing everywhere around this conference. But the Advancing RWE program is a new program we have that fills a commitment under PDUFA 7. And so this program is really designed to have early interaction in discussing ways in which RWE may be utilized to meet regulatory requirements, to share consistent decision-making processes, and really enhance the interaction around the characteristics that are being discussed on regulatory thinking around the use of RWE. There are also two other new mechanisms, Type D meetings, which focus on a narrow set of issues limited to 2 focused topics upon not more than 3 disciplines, and Interact meetings, which will facilitate efforts where there is a novel or challenging issue. And so perhaps, depending on what the context is, could be relevant. So I want to mention that, and I think you'll hear this, well, you'll hear this a lot from regulators, but talk to us early and often in drug development programs, because I think it's very helpful to have the conversation early. And then I want to shift a little bit to some collaboration and innovation. So shifting from the work we do from a regulatory aspect to our regulatory science work, which I think is integral in the combination of thinking about what we learn from regulatory science research and what we do in our regulatory frameworks. So I want to highlight where I am right now in the FDA Oncology Real World Evidence Program. Because we are receiving a large amount of real world data submissions, and specifically many in oncology, the Oncology Center of Excellence established this program in 2020 to collaboratively advance the use of real world evidence in oncology product development to facilitate patient-centered regulatory decision-making. Our program covers regulatory review, regulatory policy, education and research, and education and outreach, and regulatory science research. And as I mentioned, we're really focusing on how advances in regulatory science, our work in various constructs, can enhance regulatory review. And with that, I think there are opportunities for pharmacoepidemiology, and really for thinking through this collaborative mechanism with patients at the center and the clinical epidemiology and statistical groups really coming together to figure out novel ways and novel mechanisms of evidence generation that can be more patient-centric. And I do think that with a lot of efforts, especially in the US, this is something that is evolving and hopefully in a beneficial way. So pragmatic clinical trial methods, externally controlled trial methods, endpoints, data linkages and pooling data. I think that we've heard a lot about the challenges between disinformation and misinformation, and AI and ML. I think it's very early for regulatory use, but I think that awareness, understanding, knowledge, and generation are things that our field can contribute in these contexts to make it better, at least from an initial standpoint, even understanding ways in which it would be appropriate to use some of these methods to create, the goal within this is to create a clinically meaningful, statistically sound, epidemiologically appropriate study relevant to representative patients. So continuing along the trend of evidence modernization, I also want to talk about Project Pragmatica. Project Pragmatica is a new project within the Oncology Center of Excellence focused on advancing evidence generation for approved oncology medical products by exploring innovative design approaches that introduce functional efficiencies and patient centricity through integration with real-world routine clinical practice. And so I will provide a few design examples of this just to show. So what you see here, this is the PRECIS model, and it moves from very pragmatic to very explanatory, kind of the clinical trial to the real world, as we're used to, traditional observational types of designs. And so on the far right, the retrospective observational. So it's broad. It's likely to be and conceptualized in this model, more generalizable, more pragmatic, reflective of the real world. The clinical trial on the far left is obviously it's all about a balance, but more of from the explanatory context, and in the middle is that pragmatic. So is there a way to design trials that are streamlined, that give us the answers to the questions we need and reflect the population that we need to see, provide access, easier access for patients, and include broader eligibility criteria? And I think that's the middle where hopefully there is a lot of possibility. I'd also like to highlight that the FDA has various collaborations. I just highlighted a project, but we also have various collaborations and partnerships across centers and across academia and various other mechanisms to collaborate with us. So I'm highlighting just a few here. RCT Duplicate was a product of a collaboration through the Office of Medical Policy, and the results. This paper was very recently published and is a result of 32 emulated clinical trials. We have the Sentinel initiative. We also have the NEST ecosystem that work in a lot of our post-market and a lot of work that has gone on in the Evidence Accelerator with Reagan Udall and Friends of Cancer Research for COVID-19. And then Friends of Cancer Research doing a lot of work in the oncology area, particularly around endpoints and methods development. And then lastly, I'd really like to conclude by saying there are opportunities to collaborate with us. Regulatory science is about the science of really developing tools to modernize the development and evaluation of FDA regulated medical products, to strengthen post-market surveillance and labeling, and to invigorate our public health preparedness. And so I think all of these together, thinking about the science of developing tools, standards, and approaches to assess safety, efficacy, quality, and performance of FDA regulated medical products. So these pillars are the goals and of our regulatory science processes. And so as we think about it, there are a variety of ways to collaborate with us, and I've listed them here. We have broad agency announcements. We have the Centers for Excellence in Regulatory Science and Innovation. There are grant mechanisms, including UO1 mechanisms, research collaboration agreements, and public-private partnerships. To give you an example, within the OCE Scientific Collaborative, we focus specifically on enhancing regulatory science research in oncology. We've published 9 research areas of interest, which are listed on our website. We have over 30 projects that we work on with various groups, and I'm highlighting here the variety of mechanisms. You can see we use many different mechanisms across a variety of our programs, from project equity to patient-focused drug development, working on and study design methods, working on advancing the science of real-world data in this area. And with that, I would like to acknowledge my team at FDA and all of our leadership for the work they're doing in this area. And I would just like to maybe just conclude by saying it's really been wonderful to be here in Halifax. This is my grandmother's childhood home. She grew up 40 minutes outside of Halifax. This has been converted by the government into a museum. Called the Fisherman's Life Museum. So I had the opportunity earlier in the week to go visit with my husband and kind of see it. So for me, this is a really exciting place to be. It's a little bit like home in a different way in Canada. So it's been wonderful to be in Halifax. I hope that you are all enjoying it. And that's it for me. Thanks.
Oops, sorry, that's the. I think we've had another slide. Oh no, maybe not. Okay. Okay, great. Okay. Here's my disclaimer. And I think at this point in the session, you've heard the term knowledge translation quite a bit. And this is a schematic that you saw an earlier version that Vin presented, but really when we're talking about knowledge translation, we're talking about the traditional science delivery approach in which, pharmacoepidemiologists conduct research. They then publish that findings, they disseminate it in a variety of forums, such as the conference here today, through peer-reviewed journal publication, media, etc. And then that information is then shared with the knowledge users. This is really what we call a linear, unidirectional, asymmetric process. But there's growing recognition in many different fields of science right now that this traditional model is just not effective, not least because it assumes that those knowledge users are receiving the information that they need in the format and a way they need it, and in a timely manner to support them. So an alternative approach is what we call a knowledge exchange approach, and this is much more dynamic. It's bidirectional, and if it's working well, it involves this interaction between the knowledge producers and knowledge users in an iterative fashion, kind of continually, in which the knowledge producers are generating the kinds of data that knowledge users need, and knowledge users in turn receive this easily usable information in a timely manner. And I think it's important to note, we're here in Canada, that the Canadian Health Services Research Foundation has been really in the vanguard of promoting kind of knowledge exchange models and approaches in the healthcare sector. So given this, what might it, let's do a little thought experiment. What might it take to make this transition from a knowledge translation approach to knowledge exchange? How do we as a field, as pharmacoepidemiologists, and how does ISPE as an organization, as a key organization in the field of pharmacoepidemiology, foster connections between real world research producers and policy and policymakers and practitioners, and in order to really ensure that the high quality data and research findings that we're producing are really affecting healthcare policy decision making and clinical care. What are the structures that need to be put in place? What are the processes? Are there specific roles we need to think about creating or strengthening? And potentially, what are the incentives that could be used to make this all work? So one of the ways to think about how we could make this transition is to look to see to other related fields and see how they have been making their progress in this regard into a more kind of a knowledge exchange approach. This is an example of taken from a recent publication, well, 2015 publication, perhaps not so recent, but fairly recent publication. And this was a study done in the Netherlands public health sector, where there was recognition among leaders that the latest research in public health was not getting incorporated into the workings of the public health sector there in the Netherlands. And there was, significant delays in this regard. And so there was a qualitative study conducted of 35 different stakeholders, different organizations, all involved in the public health sector, to understand what was really hampering efforts to move towards a more knowledge exchange approach. And there was a number of key gaps identified, and several of them I've called out on this slide. But essentially, what it turned out was that the leading thing was that nobody felt it was really their job to kind of bridge that gap and to be engaged in that knowledge exchange approach, that it was enough to either generate the data or to somehow go out and find it, but nobody was taking upon themselves to do that kind of crosswalk and engagement. So there was reliance on a lot of passive knowledge sharing. Then another very important gap was that there was just a lack of capacity about knowledge exchange skills and capabilities on both ends, both among the knowledge producers as well as the knowledge users. And then there was what they called limited connectivity between the two parties, that limited opportunities for engaging and sharing and communicating. So some of the recommendations that resulted from this study and that were subsequently put into practice in the Netherlands concerned increasing the opportunities for interaction between researchers and knowledge users, offering different types of opportunities for them to meet, engage, and exchange, involving users in creating research agendas, and then in educating users about criteria for evaluating knowledge quality, to Vin's point earlier in his presentation, and how to integrate that knowledge into actual practice of public health. And then finally, to actual trainings to improve the capacity of researchers to engage in knowledge exchange types of activities, offering incentives for them to do so, and then creating opportunities for joint work and collaborations. Another example, or kind of a little mini case study that's of relevance, I believe, for pharmacoepidemiology, is drawn from the field of implementation science. And this is a taken from an article that looked at several NIH-funded research studies. The two particular grants in this case, one was focused on getting a test and treat TB strategy into practice in South Africa. The second study that was funded, and I believe that was an RO1 funded through NIH, was focused on enhancing evidence-based diabetes control among local healthcare departments across the U.S. What was really, kind of critical to both is that I hope this build works. Yep. Is that as part of the explicit research questions that these studies were funded to address were all about facilitating adoption of research evidence into actual use. And so there are specific aims around assessing the needs of the knowledge users, assessing their capacity, understanding what the barriers were that would prevent them from using this knowledge. So really building in to the actual research itself, this idea of knowledge exchange, so there's a better fit. So this is a thought for us as pharmacoepidemiologists about incorporating specific objectives in this regard into the research that we do. And then the last example that has relevance, I believe, is really from the field of regulatory science. Donna just did a fabulous job kind of talking about all the ways FDA has been leading in this regard, but I just want to have a shout out to one example, the CERCEs, the Centers of Excellence in Regulatory Science and Innovation. And these are funding FDA provides for centers of excellence to be established in academic settings that are intended to specifically foster robust and innovative approaches to advancing regulatory science and the priorities that the FDA has set and identified as important to address. This is funded, led through the Office of Regulatory Science and Innovation. And this has been in place now. This mechanism is I believe, about 10 years. And I don't believe it's been formally evaluated yet. But anyhow, it is well established at this point, but a really excellent example of fostering knowledge exchange. So what are the implications of all these of thinking about moving to a knowledge exchange type approach? For ISB itself, for the society. So there's a possibility here for us to think about how can we really encourage more active dissemination strategies as a society, strategies that are bidirectional and iterative in nature. Potentially thinking about, do we want to establish a knowledge exchange broker role of some type or several of them within the many different roles that we have here in the society? Share research setting agenda more, have more specific call outs for opportunities for knowledge producers and knowledge users to get together that are hosted or facilitated by ISB to help co-produce knowledge and encourage that exchange. And then metrics. I think we need to really think about adjusting processes to continuously improve in regard to how well are we doing in getting our data findings, our research findings into policy and practice, and really thinking about how can we start to measure that and to see our progress in that regard. And then not least is building capacity. There are specific skills and knowledge needed to be effective as knowledge in terms of knowledge exchange. How can we as a society really help that, advance that? What can we offer to those that come to these meetings, for example, or in the larger community that perhaps aren't able to attend to the annual conference? What can we do to help build capacity in this area? So thank you. Yours.
Hey, hello, everybody. My name is Toby Gerhardt. I'm professor of pharmacy and epidemiology at Rutgers, and since about an hour and a half or so, immediate past president of the society. And my role is to talk about ISPI's role in improving the transmission of pharmacoepidemiological evidence into policy and practice. Here are my disclosures. I have funding from the NIH, but more importantly, in this context, this is not what I'm going to say is not a position statement for ISPI. It's just my opinion and hopefully the beginning of a conversation within the society. So how can we, as ISPI, contribute to making the work we do more consequential? So I'm going to talk about reputation building, which I think is very important, education, research and methods contributions, as well as the convening and catalyzing functions that we can have as a society. And then there's kind of a differentiation that I see whether this impact is clinical impact or regulatory impact. I think the strategies for each and the role of the society with each might be quite different. So I think, to me, the first and foremost thing that we can do as a society, and this will take time, is really reputation building along the lines of the keynote discussion with the FDA commissioner that, as Brian had pointed out, kind of came around on real world evidence in some ways when well conducted and well implemented. And I think continuing to educate decision makers and opinion leaders about the value and validity of well-designed real-world evidence studies is just tremendously important. And whether that means educating leaders within regulatory agencies, whether educating clinicians or payers, these are all important groups that I think many of which just don't understand the value of real-world evidence and kind of have that pyramid hierarchy of evidence in their mind and see kind of observational research really at the bottom of this and don't see the value. And I think this is really therefore critical for all aspects of consequential pharmacoepidemiology. The much harder question is, how do we do this? And at least as far as I know, there is no silver bullet. There isn't an easy way to do this. I think it means as a society, as individual, publishing important work in high quality journals, continuously improving our methods and our data resources, doing really the hard and not appreciated work of peer reviewing in clinical journals to catch these reputation killers, because unfortunately, oftentimes pharmacoepidemiological real-world evidence studies conducted very poorly create very big headlines, and the work that then actually refutes these with strong methods doesn't come close to the same impact. We had yesterday a symposium led by Rishi Desai, where we did some work on drug repurposing and Alzheimer's. And there was a study published that concluded that Viagra was reducing risk of Alzheimer's by close to 70%. This was on Fox News in 8 o'clock news, with really just very basic mistakes in pharmacoepidemiology. And part of this project that we had was replicating this study and showing a null effect. That work got some recognition, but nowhere close to the recognition of the original paper. And it just doesn't take many of these poorly conducted studies to really drag down the reputation of the field. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges that we have as a field. And another approach of what we can do about this is obviously educating the next generation of data users, data scientists, all these people that are going to use real-world evidence data, but might not be pharmacoepidemiologists by training. If we can get involved in the education of these groups and at least teach some of the basics of the field. I think that might be very important. And obviously, there are hopefully many more things that we can do as a society. Moving on to education, I think that needs probably to start with educating ourselves. We are hopefully quite good at evidence generation, but much less accomplished at dissemination and applications and adoptions and these issues of implementation science. So there are many things to get better at that we can use: pre-conference courses, workshops, webinars, primers, white papers in PDS that can teach ourselves as a society. And I'm looking, for example, at you, Elaine Morado, who's an expert in implementation science within our society. And I would posit that many in this room, certainly me included, don't come close to her expertise in that field. So if we can learn from Elaine and others, that might be an important step, and it could include things like considering the clinical and regulatory implications when we formulate our aims and our study designs. As mentioned by Vin, providing succinct summaries of research findings and implications for clinicians and other stakeholders. And again, I kept the most difficult item for the end: challenging disinformation and misinformation. Again, something that came up in the keynote address. I think that is one of the difficult problems, not just for our fields, for science in general. But I think it also comes, we also have a role in educating others. So the basic educating others in the basic concepts of real-world evidence and pharmacoepidemiology, in education of clinicians, so that over time we build that appreciation for these methods in the next generations of clinicians. Again, this will not work fast, but I think it is a critically important step to kind of get, as I mentioned, kind of clinicians out of that pyramid of evidence, that real-world evidence is at the bottom and it should best be ignored. Teaching skills to appraise the quality of evidence to clinical disciplines, probably even harder, but also important, so that they can distinguish when they do peer review, when they decide whether to follow studies that are poorly conducted, that they have the skill to distinguish, and the skills to distinguish the well-conducted studies from poorly conducted studies. And then, as already mentioned, really some basic epi training for other fields, in particularly data science, that kind of will use the data and are already using the data in large numbers and publishing these data, but often without expertise in some of the basic epidemiologic methods. As a next step, I think we can also make real contributions to research and methods, pragmatic trial methods, externally controlled trial methods, how to deal with AI and machine learning and use it as useful tools, methods to study guideline adherence and clinician behavior. So I think there's also a really important ground for research in these areas. And then lastly, I think we have ISPI's convening function that's just really important. ISPI as a society has a fairly unique composition, that it really brings together members from academia, from industry, from service providers, and from regulators that interact respectfully and with international reach and with high-level scientific discussions. I think that allows us an exchange of information that is otherwise not possible. I think that's particularly valuable for kind of the next phase of use of real-world evidence in the regulatory space, and our ability to interact and talk with our regulatory colleagues, like Donna, obviously, and our panel and many others in this process. I think ISPI's function is much more tricky when it comes to clinicians. We don't really have typical clinicians at our meetings, other than, of course, our clinician researchers like Vin and many others in the room. Obviously, the ideal situation is to have a pharmacoepidemiologist clinician that sits on national guideline panels like Vin described. That's the ideal situation, but obviously we won't be able to get there in all the relevant clinical areas. But again, I think educating others, that's primarily for those of us that are in academia, being involved in the education of the next generation of clinicians, and maybe even some of the practicing clinicians, to get them some appreciation for real-world evidence and pharmacoepidemiology. And then last not least, again, as a global society, the global exchange of best practices, as was shown by Meredith. There were successful efforts in the Netherlands, and so many of those we can learn from each other internationally. So what are some next steps that we can consider? I think the most important thing is that we keep this conversation going, and it's not just a one-off. Could consider call for manuscripts. We could consider elements of this that make it into our new 2029 strategic plan. If that is the case and elements of this actually make it into the strategic plan, then there would be funds available to support these efforts potentially. And maybe at the end of this, there could be even a special interest group that looks at consequential pharmacoepidemiology of how we can make our work impactful. Again, this is the beginning, hopefully, of a conversation, not the end of it. And with that, I want to thank you, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
I'd love to have Nicole Mitten and Brian Strom, if you would like to come up. And maybe Nicole, you want to lead off with some comments, and then we're going to open it up for the larger group input. You might need to put it on.
Are we all right? Yep. Thank you. Well, thanks very much. And those were great presentations, and thank you for the invite. So I'm going to bring the health technology assessment lens to this. So health technology assessment is looking at value for new technologies, and value can be described in a number of different ways and with a number of different sciences. So as we think about real world evidence, part of the way that we assess health technologies is around the clinical evidence, right? The economic evidence, the evidence from patients and clinicians, and then also implementation. And as you think about all those different pieces of evidence, real world evidence fits very nicely into those kinds of paradigms. We look at utilization studies, drug utilization studies, incidence, prevalence. We look at natural histories of diseases. We also think about patient-reported outcomes. And so as you think about the information required to actually make an assessment to determine something has value, and depending on the perspective and whose perspective it is, again, there are lots of opportunities to use real-world evidence. And so perhaps maybe one thing I might add is it's not, there's a distinction between a decision maker and then a distinction between a payer. Right. And a payer often is very, the communication is really critical, right? The payer doesn't understand a hazard ratio. The payer doesn't understand you're very complex that you did quantile regression or probabilistic matching with hard matching here and there. They don't understand that, but they would understand some communication that tells you, what was your question? What did you do? Right? What did you find, and what does it mean? And I think that, that's really important for us to think about. How do you distill a thesis into a peer-reviewed manuscript, into something that could go into a briefing note where a very busy payer or decision maker has 10 minutes to look at your results and make a decision. So I think, how do we actually talk about that? It doesn't discount all the work that's been done, but how do we actually think about it from a communication point of view, and the education that you mentioned, Toby, right? How do we talk about evidence? People are used to the evidence pyramid, the paradigm, right? At the top, I wouldn't say the bottom, but we could be in the middle with respect to the evidence pyramid. But is there an opportunity to start to educate? And especially if I'm looking at our space, device and drug payers, right? They often have pharmacy backgrounds, or they often have, sort of industrial kinds of design backgrounds. They don't have any awareness of real world evidence. And they often think it can mean everything and nothing, right, to someone. And so as we think about how do we use it and how can we incorporate it, starting to challenge you to think a little bit differently about how you describe it and how you communicate it. So maybe I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Let me begin by saying I'm not going to give you the answer, but just some comments. I was very glad to hear the repeated comments of this is the beginning of the conversation, because I think it's really so correct, and I'm going to put that in context as well. The no-do gap, as was talked about in the beginning, of maybe a decade, maybe more, has been recognized for many decades in clinical medicine. Even when you have top of the pyramid evidence, large clinical trials, studies that were done decades ago, large clinical trials don't make it into clinical practice typically for about a year, for about a decade, before they're implemented. So it's not just a question of people don't believe our kind of research. It's with the way practitioners practice is they practice the way they were taught as interns or residents, in terms of physicians. And that's what they do for the rest of their career, even when they know they should do better. I mean, there was data 40, 50 years ago, when the first studies came out showing that long-acting benzodiazepines shouldn't be used in elderly patients because they cause people to fall. Use short-acting instead. And if you did studies of knowledge and looked at the practice for medical students, interns, residents, and different aged physicians, the younger people all knew the correct information and practiced that way. But as you got older and older, people still knew the correct information. But that's not the way they practiced. They practiced the way they had done it as a house officer. So this is a long-standing problem that is not unique to pharmacoepi. And certainly if pharmacoepi can come up with a solution to it, it would be fantastic. The person who led the division, was my division chief when I first joined faculty now 43 years ago. But if those of you who know ARC, John Eisenberg, the building ultimately was named after John. He was known for his research on changing physician prescribing 45 years ago. Obviously, it wasn't the silver bullet, and it didn't have a magical solution. So this is a huge problem, and finding a way that we can contribute to it would be fantastic. But again, the bottom line is it's not just a pharmacoepi problem. It is a problem of really looking to how do you educate physicians, not just to change knowledge. Going back to one of the slides, which were data to knowledge. I would say you need to think data to knowledge to action, because knowledge isn't enough. That's been shown for decades. I often have been in situations where I say, as a physician educator, physicians are uneducable. That what we teach them in medical school and intern residents is what they do for the rest of their lives. And it's a trying to change their behavior thereafter based on education doesn't work. It's necessary, it's not sufficient. If you don't do it, they'll resist it even more. But that is not sufficient in order to change the practice. But instead, what we need to think about is either regulatory changes, and I don't mean FDA type regulatory changes, but that obviously can help, or incentives. And again, both were talked about by the discussion. Regulatory changes. So for example, when I was at the University of Pennsylvania for 25 years, I sat on top of a system we created to control and modify the way our docs used their drugs. That was local. We had control. We had more regulation. We needed to do education before it, but education didn't do anything. One of the first things we did was, in fact, say, if you really want that drug, you can get it, but you have to fill out a form. And physicians will do anything to avoid filling out a form. And so they stopped using the drug. You can put flags in computer systems and computerized order entry. It's been, we showed a long time ago, and lots of other people have looked at it as well. Those 99% of those are overridden. And that was new for us. The field of pharmacy had known it long before us, because they have the same kinds of flags, long standing in pharmacy. So there are local ways to do it. There are incentive ways. Payers know how to do it. You figure out what what you want somebody to do, and if you pay them more, they'll do it. Or if you penalize them by paying them less, that stops the behavior. So you need to think beyond education and think about either sort of regulatory changes, again, not FDA regulatory, but again, that can certainly help. But more local regulatory changes or financial incentives or other kinds of incentives that'll drive behavior change. Shifting gears, I don't know how familiar this audience is with PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. This is what PCORI is all about. Is trying to make sure the research has impact quickly. NIH is the opposite. NIH cares about permanent knowledge. Why they focus on basic science for most of it, whether it's clinically practical or not is completely irrelevant, and they don't care. PCORI focuses on wanting knowledge, wanting it to be used right away, and convince them it's going to be by including the stakeholders who will change their behavior based on those grants within the research team when you design the research. And in fact, if you design your research, including the people who will use it, with a payer, for example, as an example, that will be a better way of making sure that when you're done, it'll become immediately practical. And again, PCORI's been in existence now 12, 13 years, and they have an entire science of stakeholder engagement accordingly. Lastly, many of the approaches, and this really builds on Toby's last comments, many of the approaches we've talked about, I summarize as an outside-in approach. How do we tell other people what they should be doing in practice? I think we need to think much more about an inside-out approach. How do we train people in our home institutions, especially those academics, and again, this is exactly what Toby said, and others, so that they begin to be more receptive to our field. But again, this is not, as I began with, this is not just a problem of our field. And of course, it's made much worse by all the scientific skepticism that's out there, driven by our politics.
Thank you. Oh, great. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Frank May. I'd like to actually, from Australia, I'd like to actually tell you a little story, and also to speak positively at this point about this very subject of information exchange. 31 years ago, in 1992, I presented to the Society its very first poster in Minneapolis. Stan may remember. That poster was about translating the evidence which Jerry Avorn, a past president of the Society, had created in 1983. We established a program which was evaluated through epidemiological methods, and which ultimately resulted in our Australian government commencing a major program of translation of knowledge and information into practice across Australia, right across the country. I have many occasions, I have presented the work at the Society, perhaps 15, 20 years ago, but I'm here to say that there is a lot that is very positive, and I'm afraid some of the panelists, I think, may be very surprised to know that, for example, in the Society's meeting in Bologna just about 8 weeks ago, there was a very large amount of evidential presentations from people from many countries in the world, around the world, who have taken on this role of information exchange. And I'm so pleased you mentioned that, Meredith. Speaking the information knowledge, that will not do it, as Brian has elegantly put it. That will not do. What does do is information exchange. We have learned a very great deal about it in the society, in the drug utilization area. And this meeting in Bologna was an ISPI meeting, and at least 7 countries who have established these programs of translating evidence into practice presented their work for society discussion. Not only that, we're just about to bring out the 2nd edition of a major textbook. That's ISPI is doing that through the Euroderg and its activities within our drug utilization SIG. That textbook contains at least, I don't have it with me, it's a 460-page book, but I think it probably contains 100 pages of very erudite writing. Not my own, mine is not erudite, it's there, but about this very topic. ISPI has been very active in this area. I think we are so diverse. I feel very much at sea when I listen to regulators speaking about the intensely difficult tasks that they undertake. And I can't even imagine how they are really achieving all that they do in keeping communities around the world safe. But I want to say that ISPI has been working, and I know I was the first in 1992 in Minneapolis, actually introducing to the society the ways in which information exchange, and Meredith, you hit the nail right on the head. Information exchange is what works. And we now know from the evidence which we've got from the EBOR study 20 years ago now, that don't talk to groups, that you will not get a change in behavior. You need to talk one-to-one with somebody to exchange information, which is drawn from the richness which comes not only from our science, but also from the evidential controlled study type information. So ISPI is active, it's doing it. And it's just a shame in a way that a lot of people don't necessarily follow that. But I can understand why, because I really don't understand, for example, how regulators manage the very difficult public health issues which they have to do all the time. So I wanted to add that to this discussion because I think it is relevant. It is perhaps time for us to have more of the drug utilization people speaking on major podiums in our society, rather than perhaps simply listening, allowing them to present their work to those people who are more interested in that drug utilization component. So thank you for this symposium. Thank you for allowing me to tell you this story, which I believe you should feel very positive about, because we have made a huge impact in at least 9 countries where we have standards for education in either academic detailing, education, or visiting. It's called different things. It's one-to-one interactions with the people at the coalface, the community practitioners who we really know need to know more about the wonderful sciences presented here, diabetes, rheumatology, and so on. These are the issues where we are making an impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Priya?
I would likewise like to thank all speakers and the panelists. I really, really enjoyed them. I'm Priya Bai from the EMA. Very much enjoyed everything you said, and also just the story Frank told. I'm very well aware. I actually used to work in academic detailing before I started for EMA, and it's great to do this one-to-one dialogue, but in public health, it's not the way we can actually go. So the question is, who can do it in the system, and how can we engage with those who can do it from in various layers, so to say, from public bodies, researchers, and going really to the individuals. But the comment I wanted to make is actually a critical one. You've talked a lot about evidence, right? And we all use the term real world evidence. We have a definition for that. We use data, and we have a feeling about what is data and what is evidence, and the way how we analyze the data somehow creates evidence. But then the next question is, when does a study finding, which we call evidence, actually qualifies for for updating a clinical guideline. The process is much longer, and clinical study findings can also be controversial in terms of strength of evidence, or they can be contradictory, maybe because also of the settings, where the data were solicited, to which populations they refer, and so on. So as regulators, we constantly have the problem. We need to consolidate various study findings until we can call it evidence enough for updating product information or for others to update guidelines. So I wanted to reflect a little bit, what standards do we need, or what approach do we need to make that happen? Because otherwise we all talk about evidence and everybody actually means something else behind evidence-based medicine. Well, thank you all. Really great session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Harry Seifert from GSK, with the usual disclaimer, speaking for myself. I wanted to build on something actually that Vin raised, and the beauty of following Brian is he said 90% of what I was thinking already. But and this is about how we get specifically clinicians, but also I guess patients, to change their behavior. And you know, all the data in the world isn't going to change a heartfelt belief, and that's the issue. But this isn't really our area of expertise, and I just wonder, at what point do we start to tap into the data sciences and the behavioral science people? And so I think that maybe by bringing them into the picture, we could help augment our approaches. And in some ways that's what Jerry Avorn was doing, right? He was seeing that, forgive me, but the marketeers are really good at manipulating people, and don't quote me on that. But, maybe we could learn from them in terms of how to influence behavior, but do it for the greater good rather than the commercial benefit. So. Oh, it's all in the book? I don't have to read it then.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to, Harry, tried to make that point in my summary slide where I talked about strategies and partnering with qualitative researchers, implementation scientists. I think as a society that has such a breadth and depth of research, to make that information exchange successful, we really need to do that and to partner and to be able to understand how can we be more effective at taking the information that we generate and bringing it forward. It is going to require a level of expertise beyond what is the bulk of our society, manipulating, analyzing, evaluating, understanding real world evidence and real world data to generate real world evidence. But how do we interface with practicing clinicians to understand and potentially to have them adopt that work into practice? It's not going to be just best practice alerts and whatnot that they could ignore, but alternative approaches. And I think starting the conversation like that today is a crucial initial step.
So want to just maybe add a little bit to this. And I think something you said was, the patient perspective and the patient voice. And we were hoping to have a patient on the panel, I think, as well. But I would say in FDA oncology, we have actually a fairly interesting model in that my director is actually responsible for patient-focused drug development, Dr. Klutz, who you saw earlier, and then I lead the real-world evidence program. So actually, our programs interact very, very commonly. So we actually have a study right now that's looking at the use of PROs in real-world data. Traditionally, the PFDD, the patient-focused drug development program at FDA, was in clinical trials, but we're learning from what they've done in clinical trials and then taking that and applying it in this context. So you do need the pharmacometricians, you do need, people that are very skilled in the patient-reported outcomes sector alongside pharmacoepidemiologists. And I think as we see, and of course, patients, and I think it's always, you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know what patients really, their perspective is. So we hold listening sessions, we take from that, and then we think about how all of our programs can work together. And so I think that it's this partnership and sharing and collaboration of skills and methods that will ultimately allow us to build better research that's truly patient-centric.
Yeah, I just want to make one other comment, which is something that Toby brought up on his last slide, which is consideration of bringing together a special interest group. I've been really amazed at how bringing together like-minded people could really generate incredible ideas. And I think that it is something that the society should really consider to try to garner the expertise and leverage ISPE's funded manuscripts to try to push this conversation forward.
Yeah, and thanks very much. And we've just lost our Australian colleague out the door as he was leaving, and I was just about to think as he was talking about success stories. There are success stories, right? So, for example, and Health Canada and our organization have put together a guidance for reporting real-world evidence. We often receive real-world evidence studies that range from a 200-page case report all the way to a peer-reviewed manuscript, and then so how do we appraise, right? So we're asking for, could you please describe it in a way? And we've used principles from this society, right? There's also a checklist that's coming out. It's either has come out, will come out at this meeting, that we will likely adopt for our own appraisals, right? So perhaps some of the metrics that we're using don't just end in a publication, but they end in, the impact part, which I always think about is inform, support, or change something, right? So I think that there are other ways to look at success as well.
Okay, so continuing with the success, so what Brian said was obviously the regulatory and also the payers. Another one is bringing in the community to speak for themselves. So one area that is also a success story was a small project that we did, and it was funded through Brian's group. And what we did was I went to the emergency physicians group in Pennsylvania and asked them whether we could survey their members with their support. And what we asked them was request for and the prescriptions that they did for prophylaxis against anthrax. And so when the data came out and they saw what they were requesting and what they actually did, then the message was coming from their own society saying, during the time of an emergency, this is what can happen. So in fact, two of the physicians, obviously there was no one giving prophylaxis against smallpox, but because the society was worried, there was all kinds of requests. But we did find out that there was a lot of prescription that the clinicians did. And so obviously most of these prescriptions were inappropriate, but having their own society go to them is one way to increase the message. The other one, I think, is, does it matter if you adhere to guidelines? So looking at the treatment outcome outside of the guidelines could itself call attention to either the regulators, or it can call attention to the payers to say, well, if you are prescribing these out of the guidelines, you are undermining patient outcome. And if you can show that the outcome was different, especially when there was non-adherence to the guidelines, that could bring attention. So I think ways to encourage and nudge adherence to guidelines could be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Stan?
I have not done an assessment of this in a while. I know Brian was on the scientifically advisory committee to the commissioner. I think did Sean follow you? Somebody followed you that from with ISPE credentials. National Academy of Science and Medicine, whatever it is, just had a long COVID advisory committee. And as far as I could tell, there was no one from this group or with pharmacoepi type of credentials. There were a few people with some epi credentials, but no one with pharmacoepi credentials. I had an interaction with them and they said, but we have epidemiologists. That was their answer. I wasn't looking for a position. I was hoping they would name somebody much more prominent than I am right now, much more active than I am. And I couldn't accomplish that. I don't know if the FDA advisory committees are well represented by people with credentials in this field, but if they're not, that's a real failing, and we ought to try to do something about that, because industries, that's who they're going to listen to. It's where the bucks are. And if you don't have influence into the financial end of things, then you're at the other end, and we're having problems, as you are hearing in this panel, of having an effect once things are approved, et cetera, et cetera. Any comments?
I can maybe make a comment on the FDA advisory committees I think you just mentioned. So I'll first say that the FDA advisory committees are, carefully selected based on the questions, or, I mean, if it's specific to a specific drug, or if it's just a general advisory committee, the question of interest or the composition of the members is directly related to expertise being represented. But I'm pleased to say that I think there are a fairly reasonable number of pharmacoepidemiologists that are represented on our advisory committees. As for the national academies, I mean, I tend to agree with you. There's actually a meeting coming up on pragmatic trials, and I happen to note that there are no epidemiologists or pharmacoepidemiologists that will be on the roster. So I don't know, that's probably something we would need to discuss with members of the academy, and then see if there's ways that we could.
Well, I think we need to consider that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, Stan. Toby just whispered, Brian can share them all. That's the problem. There aren't all that many of us who can do that. And certainly, I'm always on one committee or another for the academies, but they don't want one person to be overworked or on all of them. But you're raising a great question. Is let me follow up with them the way Donna just suggested,
Please
and
do,
ask more
because-
broadly about realize pharmacoepi is more than just epi, or less than just epi, as the case
Yeah,
may be.
well, and the other thing is, I will make the statement that the spokesman from the government on COVID over a period of time, several of them didn't have much of an understanding of epidemiology. And obviously you listen to this meeting, and there's a bunch of people here that have some idea what's going on with COVID and why weren't we represented there also.
Thanks, Dan. Elaine?
Well, I want to thank you for having the conversation. And I think what it's attracting is people here care about this a lot. So this is elevating that there are folks that are embedded within the wisdom of the society. So I just wanted to reflect, as an implementation scientist myself, this is a big topic area in the medical health services side around how do you build workforce capacity and knowledge. Not that all people are methodologists, but they become literate. And so I really wanted to acknowledge what you were suggesting, Toby. What might be there webinars or training in which we also teach ourselves basic principles from implementation science, which many of you are highlighting. In the field right now, the issue is around designing for dissemination and sustainability from the start. It talks about conceptualization. It talks about understanding context. Context includes patient, et cetera. These are all skill sets that are being taught in academic medical centers in other countries, et cetera. And there are many people in the society are the ones doing that teaching. So could there be a way, rather than just create a new SIG, because we have other SIGs in which they're focused on this. I know within the BRACE SIG, we focus on implementation science as it relates to risk minimization. But maybe a call for the society is, how do we draw from what's existing and create curriculum that can be cross-fertilizing across this? So yesterday, in the competency one, the big areas that were unmet need in our current PhD master's programs is in the area of communication and in area of regulatory science. And so there was a lot of discussion of how to tap into the wisdom of the SIGs to meet this need. So that was one. And the other is, I love the idea of the cross-fertilization with other societies. And so maybe there's some intentionality of the other journals and societies where this is being actively discussed. I mean, I know the ones in the US, Academy Health, PCORI, there's an NIH implementation science community. How might we, just like we're trying to build task force with ISPOR, also be thinking about active engagement in those societies as well? So that, you know, again, in the spirit of cross-fertilization. So just some thoughts, but glad you're having the conversation.
Thanks a lot, Elaine. I think we're really running over. It's now 10 of, and so I apologize for the last two there. I appreciate your coming up to the podium, the microphone. I just want to thank everyone. This has been just a terrific session, and I hope we have a continue the dialogue. So.
Thank you for bringing us together, Meredith.